Before anthropology textbooks existed, before Hollywood turned the Wendigo into a horned, deer-headed beast that screams in the night, there was a fear far older, far deeper, a fear anyone who has ever felt bone-cutting cold and soul-crushing hunger could understand. And it comes down to a question no one wants to face. When you are hungry beyond reason, are you still yourself? Picture this. You're deep in the northern woods, where the winter sun appears for only a few hours before sinking behind rows of pitch-black trees. The dry cold slips through every layer of fur and cloth, bites into your bones, makes even your breath feel like a blade. The wind doesn't howl, the snow doesn't whirl. Everything is just silent, a kind of silence where your heartbeat sounds louder than your footsteps. And then hunger arrives. Not the hunger that makes you irritable after a long day, but the kind that blurs your vision, makes you shiver no matter how many pelts you wrap around yourself. Your body curls inward as if trying to protect the last ember of warmth. Your mind begins erasing boundaries, even the boundary between human and animal. For the Algonquian ancestors who lived in the frozen forests of North America, this wasn't fantasy, it was reality. Winter wasn't a season, it was a trial, a predator, a god that demanded tribute. And they believed there was a spirit living inside that winter, a spirit that drifted on the freezing winds, searching for the weakest, the most desperate, and sometimes the most selfish. No one saw it, no one heard its footsteps, but they felt it when it was near. The air grew heavier, the darkness pressed closer to the skin, and the cold, a different kind of cold, slipped deep into the chest. They said the Wendigo didn't appear first as a massive creature. It arrived as a thought, a whisper, a suggestion so small and quiet you'd think it was just your imagination, a trick of exhaustion, hunger, and loneliness. But the ancestors knew better. It wasn't imagination. It was the moment the first crack appeared in the boundary of the self. And if you listened to that whisper, even once, the Wendigo found its way into your heart. From that moment on, you were no longer fighting hunger. You were fighting yourself. That is the true origin of the Wendigo, one most people have forgotten. Not a monster leaping from the shadows, but a thought growing from the place where you are weakest. In the frozen silence of the northern forest, the Wendigo doesn't need to scream. It only needs to whisper. And as the ancestors said, the most terrifying thing is not the Wendigo out there. It's the possibility the Wendigo is waiting inside you. What do you think about this origin of the Wendigo? Do you believe a person can lose their humanity from hunger and cold alone? Share your thoughts, I'd love to hear them. And if you want to continue this journey, consider subscribing to Hidden Lore. Your support is what keeps us going. Thank you so much. Now, let's return to the story of the Wendigo. Before you can understand the Wendigo, you have to understand the place that gave birth to it. Not an ordinary forest, not the picturesque mountains you see in movies, but the boreal forest, a world where humans are nothing more than small, temporary visitors. Imagine standing there, no engines, no city lights, only dark, towering trunks, cold and motionless, stretching all the way to the horizon. Snow lies so thick beneath your feet that every step cracks like you're walking across frozen bones. Here, the cold isn't just weather, it's law. In winter, the sun doesn't truly rise. It simply glides across the sky, vanishing far too quickly to give any real warmth. Temperatures drop to levels where metal freezes the moment you touch it. Your breath turns to mist instantly, then disappears as if it never existed. And strangest of all, every sound is swallowed whole. No birds, no insects, just a silence so deep it makes you feel like you don't belong there. And the Algonquian people lived in this world for thousands of years. They didn't see the forest the way modern people do as a place for adventure or recreation. They saw it for what it truly was, a living presence, an ancient power, a world with a spirit. In such a world, there was no room for mistakes. A small misstep could become a death sentence. Losing your way, falling through lake ice, being caught in a snowstorm, or simply running out of food. And in the winter months, when the snow rose to your knees and daylight felt like a rumor, people began to understand why the Wendigo existed. It wasn't a creature that appeared at random. It was the shadow of the land itself. The cold made your body tremble. The isolation twisted your thoughts. The darkness made every movement suspicious. And hunger was something no one could escape. For the ancestors here, the Wendigo wasn't just a story whispered around the fire. It was how they explained a terrifying truth. When you live in a land of ice, darkness, and hunger, you must fight every day to keep the human part of yourself alive. The boreal forest taught them 3 lessons. Nature doesn't care who you are. Life is fragile, and sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't in the forest, but in your own mind. This is where the Wendigo was born, not from some prehistoric beast, but from the brutal contrast between human weakness and nature's indifference. And when winter swallows every sound, every color, every hope, that starving spirit begins to wander. What do you think is more terrifying? The forest itself, the cold, or the thoughts that arise when a person is pushed to their limit? Share your thoughts. I want to know what chills you the most. And if you want to keep uncovering the truth beneath the ice, stay tuned for the next chapter. To understand what the Wendigo truly is, you have to forget the image that movies have forced into our minds. No deer skull, no giant antlers, no lurching creature with impossibly long teeth stalking through the forest. In the old Algonquian traditions, the Wendigo does not begin as a body. It begins as a spirit. The indigenous peoples called it the shadow of winter, a thing with no shape, no bones, no footsteps. It lives on the eastern wind, in the quiet spaces between your breaths, in that sudden shiver you can't explain. When night falls in the north, the wind sharpens like a blade. The Algonquian believed that in that wind, the Wendigo travels, not quickly, not slowly, but steadily, relentlessly, the same way the cold seeps through your skin. And the Wendigo does not seek the strong, the steady. It seeks those who are wavering, those who are weakening, from hunger, from cold, from loneliness, or from greed. To them, the Wendigo was something that attacks the inside long before it ever manifests on the outside. You won't see it standing between the trees. You won't hear it rushing toward you. No one ever said, "I saw the Wendigo over there," but many said, "I felt something standing right behind me." In the beliefs of the ancestors, the Wendigo does not take over a person by force. It enters through a thought, a tiny seed planted in your mind at the moment you're most desperate. A whisper like this: "No one will know, just this once, to survive." Under 40 below wind chills and weeks without food, that idea stops sounding insane. It starts sounding reasonable. It starts sounding necessary. And that is the moment the Wendigo finds its path in. There is no flash of light, no screams, no body stretching or claws erupting all at once, only small, dangerous shifts. You begin distancing yourself from others. You grow quiet in the long nights. You see strange dreams, shadows sliding through your mind like reminders. At that stage, the Wendigo hasn't taken you fully. It is simply waiting, patient, calculated, like winter itself, never hurried, but never merciful. And they believed that once the Wendigo found a crack in your mind, it would slip through that boundary gently, almost tenderly, until one day you realize your heart has become something else entirely, colder, heavier, and terrifyingly hollow. In the darkness of the boreal forest, there are things you don't need eyes to see. You only need to feel them. And the Wendigo is one of those things. What do you think leaves a person most vulnerable to the Wendigo's whisper? Hunger, the cold, or the darkness inside our own souls? Share your thoughts. I would truly love to read them. No one wakes up one morning and says, "I've become a Wendigo." The transformation never arrives in a sudden eruption. It comes quietly, like the cold slipping down your collar, like the wind sneaking through a crack in the doorway. The Algonquian believed the Wendigo begins taking a person from the inside, long before anything changes on the outside. It all starts with a strange sensation, a cold that cannot be warmed, even when you sit beside the fire, even when you wrap yourself in layers of fur. The flames dance in front of you, but your heart feels as cold as the winter night beyond the walls. Those touched by the Wendigo often said the cold wasn't on their skin. It lived in their chest, right where the heart beats, as if a thin layer of ice was slowly forming, growing thicker every hour. Then the thoughts begin to shift. First comes silence. The person speaks less, avoids the gaze of others. They sit alone, staring into the fire but no longer really seeing it. They grow distant, as if an invisible wall is rising between them and the rest of the world. Next, their sense of taste begins to disappear. A piece of roasted meat, often the only thing keeping people alive through winter, suddenly tastes bland. They chew without flavor, they swallow without warmth, and then they grow tired of ordinary food altogether. The old people described it this way: when the Wendigo's spirit enters, their stomach is full, but their heart is empty. Strange as it sounds, it captures the truth perfectly. The body continues living, but the mind begins to fracture, as if a part of the person is slipping away, making room for something cold, silent, and endlessly hungry. The final sign before the true transformation begins is the dream. Long, heavy, colorless dreams in which the afflicted sees themselves standing in a deep forest, snow rising to their waist, no footprints around them, no fire, no wind, only a tall, thin shadow standing a few paces away, silent, waiting, as if it already knows how the story ends. At this point, the Wendigo has not completely taken over, but it has found a crack in the heart. All it needs is one more moment of weakness, a colder night, an emptier stomach, a darker thought, and that icy spirit will step in fully. The Algonquian believed that when the Wendigo touches a person's heart, it does not destroy it, it changes it. The heart grows colder, heavier, until it becomes a solid, sharp, unfeeling block of ice, the core of the curse. And when the heart finally freezes, the last piece of human inside you disappears. Among these first signs, what unsettles you the most? The cold in the chest, the growing silence, or the dream of snow with a waiting shadow? Share your thoughts. I'd truly like to know which part leaves you the most uneasy. When the Wendigo claims the heart, the first changes are subtle, so subtle most people never notice. But night after night, day after day, those small shifts begin to stack until the person standing before you is no longer the one you once knew. The Algonquian people described this process with a simple, haunting image. The spirit eats first, the body eats after. It starts with the eyes. Their gaze grows deeper, sunken, as if sleep no longer reaches them. The elders said those eyes turn cold, not cold like ice, but cold like emptiness, as if something inside is looking out, and whatever it is no longer human. Then the skin begins to change. The person grows thin faster than any illness could explain. Not the thinness of weakness, but something uneven. The shoulders jut out sharply, the temples hollow. Meanwhile, the whole body seems to stretch, rising taller, as if the bones are being pulled upward by invisible hands. Some tribes said the Wendigo made the body grow like the shadow of itself. The hungrier it becomes, the more it eats. The more it eats, the taller it grows. The taller it grows, the hungrier it becomes. A perfect curse, a loop with no escape. But perhaps the most chilling sign is the lips. Many stories describe the possessed chewing their own lips without realizing it until the lips tear open, exposing long, yellowed teeth. Some tales say they chew so much they lose their lips because pain no longer means anything. Only hunger remains, and the hollow echo of need that can never be satisfied. Their muscles become strange, weak, and strong at the same time. Not the strength of a well-fed person, but the frantic strength of someone who no longer feels limits. And then they begin to hear things ordinary people cannot. The crunch of snow deep in the forest, the snap of a branch from hundreds of meters away, the heartbeat of another person in the silent night. Every sense sharpens like that of a predator, yet at the same time, they lose the most important thing. the ability to recognize their loved ones, not because they forget, but because the Wendigo cannot see people, it only sees meat. This is the most terrifying moment when reason and memory are still there, but no longer strong enough to stop the hunger from moving the body. The Algonquian once warned, when a person grows taller as they grow thinner, when they shiver from cold in the heart and not on the skin run. They understood a simple truth. The Wendigo does not become a monster in an instant. It grows piece by piece each wind gust, each night of hunger, until the human is nothing more than an empty shell, stretched and twisted into the shape of an ancient curse. Which detail of this transformation haunts you the most? The eyes, the skin, or the way the body grows taller, as if pulled upward by the darkness itself? Share your thoughts. I'd love to know which part chills you the most. In Algonquian tradition, the Wendigo isn't just a starving ghost or a stretched, distorted body. When the possession is complete, when the heart has frozen and the body has changed, what emerges is a fully formed predator. Not loud, not clumsy, not the awkward movie monster pop culture has turned it into. The Wendigo, in its original cultural form, is a supernatural hunter. The old stories say the Wendigo moves faster than any creature in the forest. Not fast in an explosive, visible way, but fast in a way the human eye cannot track. You look away for a second, it's gone. You blink once, it's somewhere else. Its footsteps make no sound, as if the cold itself is the path it glides across. The Wendigo's skin does not feel frost. The cold that kills a human in hours only strengthens it. It belongs to winter, as if its body and the season are one. But what truly terrified the ancestors wasn't its speed or its strength, it was its voice. The Wendigo can mimic human speech with terrifying accuracy, especially the voices of loved ones. It can call your name from the darkness, in a voice thin and trembling, swallowed partly by the wind. It can imitate the cry of a child in the woods, a muffled, fragile sound, close enough to make you think a baby is only a few steps away. And on a long, freezing night, when you're shivering inside your shelter, you'll hear that voice and wonder, is someone out there who needs help? That is the mistake many never got the chance to correct. Generations passed down the story of a young hunter. He heard the voice of his sister dead for years calling him from behind the pines. The voice was faint, thin, as if muffled by falling snow, yet unmistakable. Come here, little brother. He stepped into the forest, following that voice, and was never seen again. That is the Wendigo's hunting art. No chasing, no roaring, no crashing through the woods. It waits, it lures, it uses memory, affection, loneliness as bait. The Algonquian people understood that the Wendigo doesn't want to chase a strong, healthy target. It wants someone standing on the edge, hungry, tired, confused, or desperate. And when the Wendigo finally acts, it doesn't attack like an animal. No wild thrashing, no chaotic violence, no noise. It appears behind its prey, a tall, thin silhouette, silent, as if it has been standing there all along. The elders said the Wendigo never truly hunts in the forest. It hunts inside the human mind and strikes at the exact moment a person breaks. Among all the traits that make the Wendigo the perfect hunter, its speed, its immunity to the cold, its ability to mimic the voice of loved ones. Which one terrifies you the most? Share your thoughts. I'd love to know which part of the Wendigo's nature chills you the deepest. Before the Wendigo truly takes over a body, before the limbs stretch, before the eyes sink, before hunger becomes a silent scream, the Algonquian people believed there was a stage in which the victim could still be saved. They called it Wendigo sickness, a strange condition, half spiritual and half psychological, yet so real that anyone who lived in the northern forests had seen it at least once in their life. It doesn't begin with screaming or wild frenzy like in the movies. It begins with silence. Those who fall into Wendigo sickness withdraw into themselves. Not the ordinary kind of sadness, but a complete retreat from the community. They avoid eye contact, sit away from the fire circle, remain in the dark for hours without speaking a word. And everyone in the village understands. When someone becomes afraid of being near others, that is never a good sign. Next comes the change in appetite. The victim begins refusing all food, dried meat, smoked fish, even fat-rich broth foods that kept entire tribes alive through the winter. Not because they're tired of eating, but because they can no longer taste anything. Everything becomes dull, empty, meaningless. Meanwhile, their stomach won't stop twisting with hunger, as if a second mouth has opened inside them. Some said they felt something else is hungry inside me, and clearly that something was not them. Then comes the cold, not the cold on the skin, but the cold in the chest, as if a slab of ice were being pressed directly into the heart. The sick sit close to the fire and still shiver. They wrap themselves in thick furs and still whisper, "I'm so cold, so cold." That was the unmistakable sign for the Algonquian elders. The heart is beginning to freeze. At this stage, the victims often dream the same dream. A white forest with no wind, no sound. A tall, thin figure standing just at the edge of sight. A small voice calling, not quite speaking, not quite breathing. They wake in the night, drenched in cold sweat, whispering, "Someone is calling me." This is when the family becomes terrified. Not that the victim will harm someone, but that the person they love is slowly disappearing. To the Algonquian, Wendigo sickness wasn't simply madness. It was a battle between the human spirit and another spirit. On one side, memory, love, loyalty. On the other, darkness, hunger, and the whisper of winter. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part is this. The victim still knows they are changing. They ask for help. They fight to stay conscious. They cry through the night, terrified they might hurt the ones they love. And that is why Wendigo sickness is the most frightening stage. It gives you enough awareness to understand the horror happening to you, but not enough strength to stop it. Among these signs, the silence, the withdrawal, the loss of taste, or the cold in the heart, which one chills you the most? Share your thoughts below. I'd truly like to hear how you feel about this shadowed stage of the human soul. When someone begins showing signs of Wendigo sickness, when they grow quiet, cold inside, refuse food, and dream of a tall, thin figure standing in the snow, the Algonquian people knew they could not wait. If they acted too late, the human soul would be swallowed, and a new Wendigo would step out of the darkness. This was the moment they turned to the strongest, most feared, and most sacred ritual in their tradition, the shaking tent, a doorway between two worlds. The shaking tent was unlike any other structure in the village, small and narrow, built from long wooden poles tied with rawhide, covered with bark and braided cords. Yet its meaning reached far beyond its simple appearance. To the community, it was not a shelter, it was a doorway, a passage between the human world and the spirit world, both benevolent and dangerous. The shaman, the one who served as the bridge between the two realities, was the one who stepped inside. But before entering, he was tied with rawhide straps to prove that whatever happened inside the tent was not the work of his own body. They tied his wrists, they tied his ankles, they wrapped his chest. And yet, once the ritual began, the tent would still shake as if a storm were trapped inside it. When the spirits entered the tent, the people formed a circle around the tent, holding their breath. In the silence, the shaman began to sing. His voice was low, stretched across the air like a call from an ancient age. Then, other sounds joined in. At first, just the faintest rustling, but quickly, whispers, cries, and voices, many voices, rose all at once, as though countless spirits were pushing to enter a space far too small. The tent shook, not gently, but violently, so violently that those standing closest had to grip the support poles to keep from stumbling. In Algonquian belief, the spirits that arrived were not always kind. Some were ancestral spirits, some animal spirits, some forest spirits, and if the victim truly carried Wendigo sickness, then the hungry shadow spirit was listening too. The most important questions. The shaking tent was not meant to exorcise immediately. It existed to diagnose, to determine whether the person could still be saved. The shaman would ask, "Is there an evil spirit inside this person? How strong is it? Do we still have time?" The spirits answered through echoes inside the tent, distorted, distant, as if the voices were blown across miles of frozen wind. But to the Algonquian, these answers were more certain than any test. And when the spirits confirmed that the Wendigo had begun eating into the heart, the community knew they were standing at the thinnest boundary of all. A human fading away, a Wendigo being born. The shaking tent was more than a spiritual ritual. It was the place where the community confronted winter's most terrifying truth. Sometimes the predator does not come from outside the forest, but from inside the heart of someone they love. If you stood in that circle, listening to the tent shake, hearing voices that did not belong to any human, what would you feel? Fear? Awe? Or sorrow for the person fighting their own soul? Share your thoughts below. When the shaking tent confirmed that the Wendigo spirit had touched someone, when the voices from the spirit world warned that the heart is beginning to freeze, the Algonquian community turned to one of their hardest, most painful rituals. An attempt to pull the human soul back before the Wendigo claimed the body entirely. This was not a gentle ceremony, not a soft prayer, not a miracle. It was a real battle between a human and a starving spirit. Hope remains, but time is running out. At this point, the victim is already cold from the inside, their eyes drifting far away, every bit of food tasteless. But they are still human. They still remember their family. They still fear hurting someone. They still whisper, "Please help me." And this is where a community must choose: run from them or fight to bring them back. The Algonquian chose the second, even knowing they might fail. The only weapon, hot fat. The healing ritual revolved around something that sounds strange to modern ears, forcing the victim to consume hot, melted animal fat. Not meat, not medicine, not herbs, but boiling fat, taken from freshly hunted animals, melted over the fire, and fed by the spoonful, sometimes by force. It sounds harsh, but the logic was perfectly clear to the Algonquian. The Wendigo is a spirit of ice, of hunger, of hollow cold. The victim's heart is becoming a block of ice, so the people used the strongest force they had to fight it: heat and energy. To them, fat was the most powerful part of the animal. It warmed the body, fueled survival, and fed the sacred fire. Hot fat, they believed, could melt the ice growing inside the victim's heart. It had to be hot, it had to be thick, it had to be poured into the body before the frozen spirit could consume the last piece of humanity. A ritual both terrifying and deeply human. The victim often resisted not from pain, but because the Wendigo inside them hated the fat. It prefers hunger. It lives through hunger. It is hunger. So the family held the victim down, hands, legs, head, not to hurt them, but to save them. This was not violence. It was desperation. The last attempt to pull a loved one back before the darkness stepped in completely. Some victims vomited the fat immediately. Some screamed. Some begged for it to stop, because the heat felt like burning fire inside their chest. And sometimes, only sometimes, the ritual worked. The sick person would tremble, gasp, collapse, and when they opened their eyes again, their gaze had returned, their breath held warmth, and the heart, though not fully healed, was no longer made of ice. Those moments were considered true miracles. But if the hot fat did not melt the icy heart, if the victim remained cold, distant, still dreaming of the tall shadow waiting in the snow, the Algonquian knew a boundary had been crossed. And what came next was no longer healing. When you read about this ritual, what strikes you more? The horror of the method, or the deep compassion of a family fighting with everything they have to save the soul of someone they love? Share your thoughts. I'd love to know how this ritual feels to you. There was one truth the Algonquian understood, with painful clarity so clear that no one in the community dared deny it. Not everyone with Wendigo sickness can be saved. There comes a point when, no matter how tightly the family holds their loved one down, no matter how fiercely the shaman shakes the spirit tent, no matter how much hot fat is forced down their throat, The human soul keeps slipping deeper into the dark, and at that moment, the truly frightening thing is no longer losing a loved one. The frightening thing is letting them live one more night. Because when the frozen heart is fully formed, when the eyes hold no trace of humanity, when the Wendigo's whisper turns into command, that person is no longer a person. They have become a true Wendigo. The day the community must decide. There is no screaming, there is no begging, no thunder to mark the horror, only a heavy silence as the village understands. This person is no longer among them. The shaman, the elders, and the family sit around the fire to speak, not to decide whether the person must die, but how their soul can be released, and how the community can remain safe. For them, destroying the Wendigo was not an act of cruelty. It was a ritual of release, a sacred duty to prevent the hungry spirit from occupying another body. The final hunt. When all is decided, the ritual hunt begins. The Algonquian believed the Wendigo had strength far beyond any human. It ran faster than predators. It felt no cold. It felt no pain. And sometimes, it could mimic voices to draw victims closer. The hunt was never simple. It was led by the shaman, or the best warrior. They prepared themselves with sharpened weapons or silver bullets, binding ropes, fire, and above all, the courage to look upon a loved one wearing the shape of a monster. In many accounts, the Wendigo was killed by beheading or a final bullet, but that was only the first step. The frozen heart must be destroyed. Even when the body lay still on the snow, the ritual was not over. The Algonquian believed the Wendigo was a spirit, not the flesh. If the frozen heart was not destroyed, the hungry spirit could return, enter another person, or drag wandering souls into the dark. So they performed the hardest task of all, opening the chest and removing the block of ice from the heart. This ice was not ordinary. It was sharp as glass, cold as the forest's deepest shadow, and to them, it was the final proof that the Wendigo had consumed the soul. The block of ice was placed onto a funeral pyre, along with the dismembered body. The fire had to burn for hours, sometimes days, to ensure no shard of the ice remained. Only when the flames died did the community believe the hungry spirit had left this world. A ritual of sorrow, not victory. No one celebrated. No one cheered. This was not triumph. It was loss. The family wept. The shaman prayed. The community stared silently into the ashes. They had not slain a monster. They had released a soul, someone once loved, from endless hunger and pain. Among all Wendigo rituals, this was the one that weighed heaviest on the human heart. Not because of its brutality, but because of the despair behind it. If you stood before that pyre, the flames flickering in the snowy night, the frozen heart melting into vapor, what emotion would rise in you? Fear, sorrow, or relief that they were finally free? Share your thoughts. I'd truly like to hear them. For thousands of years, the Wendigo existed wholly within the spiritual world of the Algonquian peoples, unbroken, unmisinterpreted, untouched by outsiders who might twist it into entertainment. But then, in the 17th century, a group of men crossed the ocean carrying their own beliefs, languages, and ways of seeing the world. The Jesuit missionaries. They came from Europe's great cities, Paris, Rouen, Bordeaux, places where theology and church doctrine shaped every thought. And when they stepped into the northern forests for the first time, they encountered a world that Christian teaching could not fully explain. The first meeting between two worlds. The Jesuits did not come to study culture. They came to convert. They saw the indigenous peoples as lost souls, unaware of the light of God. But then they heard stories whispered around the fire. Stories of a cold spirit riding the wind, of people transformed by hunger and despair, of hearts freezing and hunger growing without end. And instead of seeing these tales as spiritual metaphors about imbalance and survival, they interpreted them in the only framework they knew. Wendigo equals a demon, not a forest spirit, not a moral warning, not a lesson about greed, but a devil from Satan tormenting the natives. And that was the moment the story began to drift away from its true origin. The distorted pages. The Jesuits wrote everything down. Today, These writings are considered valuable records, some of the earliest written descriptions of the Wendigo, but every page was filtered through the rigid worldview of Christian theology. What they saw was shamans, sorcerers, shaking tent, witchcraft, forest spirits, demons, healing rituals, pagan superstition. They believed their holy mission was to banish the Wendigo with a cross, as if this spirit were identical to the demons of European exorcism tales. In some accounts, Jesuits claimed they had personally confronted the Wendigo, raising a crucifix and chanting Latin prayers to expel it. But to the Algonquian people, these gestures were foreign symbols, meaningless against a spirit whose nature the Europeans did not understand. A profound misunderstanding. The Jesuits were not malicious. They were educated, disciplined men who endured cold, hunger, and sickness to live among the peoples they hoped to convert. But they had only one lens through which they could interpret the unknown, the lens of Christian theology, so they could not comprehend a universe where spirits are not angels or demons, but neutral beings, a story in which evil doesn't come from Satan, but from unchecked human greed, a healing ritual grounded in community strength, not supernatural miracles, a winter spirit representing imbalance, not rebellion against God. To them, the Wendigo was just another demon in a long list of dark forces they believed haunted the world. But to the Algonquian people, the Wendigo was a mirror reflecting humanity's most dangerous flaw. These two worldviews were never going to meet. The moment history changed the Wendigo forever. From this point forward, the Wendigo began a new journey. Forest spirit, European demon, pop culture monster. These early misunderstandings were the turning point that pushed the Wendigo away from its true origins and closer to the creature the modern world imagines today. But the worst part was yet to come, because just 2 centuries later, this misunderstanding would shape how society interpreted a chilling, tragic murder case. The case of Swift Runner, the man who terrified all of Canada. What do you think about Europeans interpreting the Wendigo as a demon? Do you believe this misunderstanding was accidental, or simply the unavoidable clash of 2 vastly different cultures? Share your thoughts below. After the era of the Jesuit missionaries who saw the Wendigo through the lens of demons, a new generation arrived with a completely different way of explaining the world. Not with a cross, not with ritual, but with science. In the early 20th century, Western anthropologists and physicians traveled into the northern forests. They carried notebooks, ink pens, wax cylinder recorders, and an unshakable belief in modern thinking. Everything has a rational explanation, even the Wendigo, from spirit to psychiatric syndrome. When they heard the Algonquian stories of frozen hearts, endless hunger, transformations driven by desperation, and cannibalism, scientists didn't see demons or spirits. They saw symptoms. Their reasoning was simple: long winters, extreme hunger, total isolation, psychological stress and trauma could all produce what they called a mental breakdown. So, they gave it a clinical name: cold, structured, and completely detached from the world it described. Wendigo psychosis, a psychiatric syndrome associated with the Wendigo. To them, this was a culture-bound syndrome. When someone under extreme distress uses the cultural language available to them to explain dangerous impulses. In other words, the monster isn't real, only the human mind collapsing under pressure, and Wendigo is the cultural mask for that collapse. Academia loved this tidy explanation. For scholars, it made everything neat. Wendigo equals delusion, caused by starvation. Cold, paranoia. Frozen heart equals physiological numbness from extreme cold. Hunger for human flesh equals hallucination due to malnutrition. Body distortion equals exaggeration through oral storytelling. Spirit possession equals cultural interpretation of extreme behavior. Within just a few years, the Wendigo appeared in university textbooks as a classic example of a culture-bound mental disorder. Reports were written in the same tone: clinical, detached, and almost too clean. The ancient spirit was placed under a microscope and stripped of its sacred meaning. But there was something science couldn't explain. If Wendigo was only hunger-born delusion, why did generations of indigenous people describe the same patterns with near-perfect consistency? Why did the fear exist for thousands of years long before widespread starvation? Why did Wendigo sickness appear even when there was no real hunger? And the most troubling question of all, why were there cases science couldn't explain away? When someone eats human flesh in starvation, science has an explanation. But when a healthy, well-fed, stable person, living in a community with plenty of food, suddenly kills their entire family and insists, "Something took over me?" That doesn't fit the model. Indigenous elders argued that anthropologists only saw symptoms, but never the cause. That science described how the spirit affects the mind, but not what the spirit actually is. That a frozen heart is not just a metaphor, that something real moves through the deep forest. And then, a case emerged. A case so horrifying that even the most rational, scientific minds hesitated. A case that made society ask, does Wendigo psychosis really explain everything? It was the story of a man named Swift Runner, a story that blurred the line between myth and reality more than anyone expected. What do you think? Is the Wendigo simply a culture-bound psychological disorder, or is there something older, darker, and beyond scientific language at work? Share your thoughts below. I'm eager to hear your perspective. Before the story turned into a frostbitten nightmare etched into Canadian history, before his name became a dark legend woven into Wendigo lore, Swift Runner was not someone people feared. He was the man everyone trusted. Swift Runner Kakisekojan in Cree was tall, strong, calm, and known for his unmatched skills in the wilderness. He was a skilled hunter, a reliable guide for the Hudson's Bay Company, and even for the Northwest Mounted Police, Canada's newly formed police force. No one had any reason to doubt him. No one imagined he could do anything cruel. No one could foresee that he would become the center of one of the most horrifying stories the land would ever witness. A world collapsing. But by the late 1870s, the world of the Cree people was falling apart. The buffalo, their lifeblood, had been hunted nearly to extinction by fur traders and colonial policies. Food was scarce. Winters grew longer and harsher. Disease spread, and the Canadian government pressed harder, pushing indigenous communities into settlements and away from their nomadic life. To Europeans, this was reform. To indigenous communities, it was catastrophe. And in this landscape of desperation, Swift Runner made a decision many Cree families made every year: go deep into the wilderness with his family to hunt and survive the winter. Fall 1878. The fateful journey. Swift Runner left the Cree camp in late autumn, just before the first snowstorms. With him were his wife, their 6 children, his younger brother, and his mother-in-law. A large group, but for a hunter as capable as Swift Runner, it wasn't unusual. They traveled north into the forests of Alberta, looking for a place where food could still be found. No one in the community knew that this would be the last time they ever saw the family together. The snow fell, the forest swallowed them, and winter stretched on quiet, white, and grave-like. Spring 1879. He returns alone. When the ice thawed and people returned to the trading posts, Swift Runner was nowhere to be seen. Then one afternoon, he appeared at the Street Albert Mission, thin, but not starving, shaking, but not with hunger, and with eyes hollow in a way no one could describe. The priests asked where his family was. Swift Runner said, They all died of starvation this winter," he cried. He spoke of despair, cold, isolation, failed hunts. He said he was the only survivor. The priests believed him. They fed him, gave him a place to sleep, comforted him like a man who had lost everything. But a few days later, they began to notice something impossible to ignore. Swift Runner showed none of the physical signs of starvation. A truly starving person is skeletal, loses hair, can barely walk, has muscles wasted to nothing. But Swift Runner was still strong, too strong, and slowly, a terrifying thought formed. His story could not be true. Whispers began to surface. Before leaving the previous fall, Swift Runner's mother-in-law had confided in a few people. She felt uneasy about him, a fear she couldn't explain, a bad omen about the winter trip. In autumn, nobody paid attention to her warning, but now, those loose threads began to weave into something darker. Police were called. They didn't accuse Swift Runner, not yet. They simply asked him to take them back to the winter camp, to find the bodies, to confirm the deaths. Swift Runner agreed, but within days, they would realize the trip was not a search for victims of hunger. It was a journey toward a far more horrifying truth. At this moment in the story, what emotion dominates for you? Pity for a man who claimed to lose his entire family, or the dark suspicion that something unspeakable was being hidden? Share your thoughts below. When the police party followed Swift Runner back into the northern Alberta forest where he had camped with his family, they entered a space colder than the melting spring around them. A cold not born from weather, but from a story suspended in the air, waiting to be revealed between the silent, upright trees. The journey was slow, bleak, and filled with strange moments. Swift Runner, once a trusted guide for the police themselves, now seemed unsure, confused. He lost his sense of direction, stopped without warning, stared into the gaps between the pines as if listening to something only he could hear. Some officers suspected he was deliberately stalling, but others, watching him by firelight at night, wondered, perhaps he feared what awaited them as much as they did. A winter no one survived to describe. The winter of 1878-1879 had been harsh for the Cree, not because of endless storms, but because of desperation in small, isolated camps scattered through the forest, each family surviving with whatever they could find. Inside Swift Runner's winter camp, 9 people, limited supplies, failed traps, and a long distance from any trading post. But the disturbing detail was this: no other camps reported starvation that winter. Cree hunters later told police the season was not that bad. Game was available. Families made it through. So why did Swift Runner's entire family die? Except him? The question began circling in every mind on the expedition. The silence of the camp. At last, they arrived. A small clearing in the woods, a collapsed shelter, no smoke, no voices, no trace of life. But the most chilling part was not what they found. It was what they did not find. No graves, no burial mounds, no signs of traditional Cree funerary rites. Only silence. A silence that made the men shiver, the kind that told them people had lived here, but had not left in any natural way. The first signs of the truth. The officers spread out, quietly examining the area. Minutes later, someone called out, not loudly, but with a tense whisper, as if afraid something might hear them. In the thinning snow, they found small human bones, fractured at the ends, the marrow extracted. Experienced hunters recognized the technique immediately. This was not animal bone, this was human. And marrow extraction is a practiced skill, one every hunter knows. The deeper they searched, the worse it became. Children's bones, adult bones, all broken, cracked open, or cut apart with unmistakable precision. One officer murmured, "This isn't a place where a family starved. This is a slaughterhouse." Swift Runner's silence. When they turned back to Swift Runner, he didn't react like an innocent man. He didn't protest. He didn't defend himself. He just stood there, silent, breathing slowly, his eyes empty in a way no one could describe. No panic, no explanations, no grief, only a hollow stillness that made the officer's skin crawl. And in that moment, they understood. They were about to uncover the truth of a winter no one survived, except the one who caused it. Which is more frightening to you? The sight of bones cracked open for marrow on the snow, or the hollow, emotionless gaze of the only survivor? Share your thoughts below. When the first human bones were found around the winter camp, The police officers already knew they had stepped into something far more horrifying than anything they imagined when they set out. But that was only the surface. What they were about to witness inside the collapsed shelter was far worse. Stepping into what used to be home, the winter lodge of Swift Runner was no longer a structure. Part of it collapsed, part of it torn by wind, the rest nothing more than a dark shadow of the life that once existed there. But the moment the first officer bent down and stepped inside, he stopped dead in his tracks. The first smell that hit him was not decay, not disease, but burned fat. On the old fire pit sat a blackened cooking pot, its sides still lined with a thin crust of hardened grease. When they lifted the lid, inside was the unmistakable remains of rendered human fat. A pale, waxy solid, formed exactly the way marrow fat congeals in deep winter cold. In the corner of the shelter, they found a tiny child's moccasin, perfectly preserved in the snow, fragile, quiet, a memory frozen in place. And the most devastating evidence of all, bones inside the tent, bones outside the camp. Everywhere they looked, human bones littered the ground. An adult leg bone, chopped cleanly with an axe. The small ribs of a child so small one officer had to turn away. A femur split perfectly to extract marrow. Finger bones, almost intact. The cuts, the breaks, the separations, all of them done with the practiced skill of a seasoned hunter. Not animals, not accidents. A methodical hand. One officer whispered, "Someone spent the whole winter doing this." No one answered. The food store, the detail that changed everything. If the family had died of starvation as Swift Runner claimed, the camp should have been empty of supplies. But when they opened the small storage pit nearby, the sight froze everyone. There was food left. Not much, but enough to survive. Smoked meat, dried fish, a small bag of animal fat, some flour. No sign of desperation. No sign of extreme hunger. No sign of a winter too terrible to endure, as Swift Runner had described. And that made the truth sharper than any blade. This was not a tragedy of survival. This was systematic killing. Swift Runner breaks before the truth, but not in the way they expected. When the officers brought him inside and showed him what they found, Swift Runner did not scream. He did not flee. He did not deny anything. He simply stared, long, silent, eyes empty, a void where human emotion should have been. No horror, no sorrow, no outrage, just stillness, cold and absolute. Finally, he exhaled and whispered, "Something took hold of me." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an excuse. It was as if he was stating a reality he himself didn't fully understand. And in that moment, the police realized the story had crossed beyond crime. It had entered a realm where myth and reality blurred, a place where no one could say with certainty what had happened in those endless nights. No turning back. With the horrific evidence scattered everywhere, the officers had no choice. They tied Swift Runner's hands, not because he resisted, he didn't, but because he had to be taken away, to face the truth the winter had buried. What they didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that the rest of this story would change the Wendigo forever. Which detail in that shelter horrifies you the most? The tiny child's moccasin, the pot of rendered human fat, or the untouched food that proves starvation was never the cause? Share your thoughts below. Swift Runner was bound and escorted out of the forest, but the journey back was unsettling. He did not scream. He did not resist. He did not attempt to flee. He walked like a man who had accepted something no ordinary human could comprehend. Some officers even said he looked relieved, as if he no longer had to carry a secret too heavy for the mind to bear. But no one was prepared for what he was about to say. Back at Fort Saskatchewan, Swift Runner was taken to the police post at Fort Saskatchewan, where he would await questioning and trial. When they removed his bindings, he did not ask for water, food, or explanations. He simply sat down and said, "I know why you brought me back." Calm, collected, far too steady for a man surrounded by evidence of horror. The interrogation began with one simple question: what happened in the forest? And for the first time since his arrest, Swift Runner lowered his head and broke into tears. his story, or the truth, as he understood it. He said the winter wasn't just cold, it was heavy, as though the sky itself pressed down on their shelter. That when the snow buried their camp, he began to hear a voice, not the wind, not a person, a low, weak whisper repeating night after night, "Come here." At first, he fought it. He drank hot water. He prayed. He kept the fire blazing. But the voice grew clearer, gentler, sweeter, like a loved one calling from just out of sight. Then he began to dream, dreams where he stood in deep snow, while a tall, thin figure with hollow eyes beckoned him forward. Every morning he awoke hungrier, not ordinary hunger, a deep, tearing hunger nothing could soothe. And then one night he could barely remember. The voice said a single word, "Eat." Swift Runner paused here. No one spoke. No one argued or accused. They wanted the whole truth. The moment humanity slipped away, he said he killed the first family member as though trapped in a fog, not from starvation, not from desperation, but because his hands moved by themselves under the control of something inside. He said he saw the bodies, but did not recognize them as wife, brother, or child. To him, in that moment, they were only meat. The word made the interrogating officer's knuckles turn white. Swift Runner said he ate, not because he wanted to, but because if he didn't, the thing inside would seize full control of his mind. He cried when he said that after the first killing, he knew he had crossed a line he could never return from. After that night, he no longer knew who he was. I felt the cold in my heart. I knew I was becoming what the old people call a Wendigo. The strange contradiction, the most confusing part for the officers wasn't the confession. It was Swift Runner's state of mind. He seemed genuinely tormented, remorseful, sorrowful, but he did not behave like someone in psychosis. There was no incoherence, no hallucination during questioning, no break from reality. He sat perfectly lucid, while describing what sounded like a supernatural possession. He existed in a strange in-between state, clear-headed like a rational man, yet speaking of becoming the Wendigo as though it were real. No one knew whether to interpret his words through reason or through myth. When truth has no boundaries left, the interrogation ended in silence. No officer could say what they believed. No one offered a conclusion, and no one had an answer to the question that now haunted them all. Was Swift Runner the perpetrator of a crime, or the victim of an ancient spirit? Science said one thing, folklore said another, and before them sat a man collapsing between two worlds. Everyone knew what came next. A trial, one unlike anything the frontier had ever seen. A trial where society would be forced to choose a truth it did not fully understand. If you were the one interrogating Swift Runner, what would you believe? That he was suffering from a mental disorder? Or that he had truly been overtaken by a cold, ancient spirit? Share your thoughts below. When Swift Runner was brought to trial in the summer of 1879 at Fort Saskatchewan, the courtroom quickly became the center of attention across the northern frontier, not just because of the horror of the crime, but because no one truly understood what they were judging. Were they judging a man, or were they judging an ancient spirit of darkness? A trial unlike any other. The Canadian legal system was still in its infancy. Judges, lawyers, and police were almost all Europeans, men who knew little of Cree beliefs or the spiritual world of the First Nations. They were used to dealing with petty theft, land disputes, and the occasional violent crime. But a man who ate his entire family, in a winter when others survived, under conditions that were not unusually dire, no one had prepared for such a case. Swift Runner was charged with killing his wife, his mother-in-law, his 6 children, and his brother, one by one, over the course of the long winter, and the evidence was irrefutable. Human bones cracked for marrow, rendered human fat in the pot, clean axe cuts, children's belongings. There was no debate about what happened. The only question was, why did it happen? The law's reasoning. He was still sane. The defense tried to argue that Swift Runner had gone insane, that he had lost all control, that he did not understand his actions. But the judges, trained in Western legal reasoning, did not agree. They saw a large, strong man who spoke clearly, logically, calmly. No hallucinations, no disorganized thought, no signs of mental collapse. He described events in order, cried at moments that made sense, paused when overwhelmed. He did not resemble a madman, nor a frenzied killer. And in the 19th century legal world, if you could speak coherently, you were legally responsible for what you did. The insanity plea was rejected. Swift Runner's confession, not to justify, but to release. When Swift Runner spoke, he did not attempt excuses. He did not plead. He did not twist the story. He did not blame anyone. He repeated only one truth, over and over. I felt something inside me. It was cold. It was hungry. It controlled me. People in the courtroom shivered, not because they believed a Wendigo was real, but because they could not imagine a father slaughtering 6 children without any earthly motive. A judge wrote in his notes, "If he is insane, then it is a madness no book can explain." The silence in the courtroom and the final verdict. It took the jury less than a day to decide. They could not deny the crime. They could not accept spiritual possession as a defense. They could not find any legal reason to spare him. Swift Runner was found guilty of murder in the highest degree. His sentence, death by hanging. The date was set immediately. No one applauded. No one cheered. There was no sense of triumph or justice. Instead, a strange silence lingered, as if everyone knew they had judged not just a man, but a legend, an old fear, a spirit they did not truly understand. The tragedy of 2 worlds. For the Cree, the case was complicated. They believed Swift Runner had been overtaken by the Wendigo, a spirit that preyed on the vulnerable during isolated winters. For Europeans, he was simply a vicious murderer, and in the space between those 2 worldviews, the Wendigo stepped from myth into reality, becoming a symbol of fear, hunger, desperation, and cultural conflict that was never resolved. If you sat in that courtroom, between the weight of the law and the shadow of ancient fear, whose side would you take? Would you see Swift Runner as a murderer or as a victim of a spirit of winter? Share your thoughts below. After the trial, people across the northern frontier spoke of Swift Runner with a confusion they couldn't articulate. The crime was clear. The motive did not exist. And the explanation he offered, a starving spirit taking hold of his mind, left everyone in a grey zone where no one dared believe it, but no one dared dismiss it either. Even the officers who interrogated him, who looked into his eyes and listened to him describe the voice in the snow, could not fully declare him insane. There was something in his despair, an awful sincerity that made hesitation unavoidable. Science explains. A rare psychiatric break. Doctors, anthropologists, newspapers, and the Canadian government all struggled to find a rational answer, and eventually they constructed a modern, tidy, clinical explanation. Wendigo psychosis, a culture-specific mental disorder. According to this theory, the disorder only appears in cultures that believe in the Wendigo. A person, under extreme stress from hunger, cold, or isolation, might believe they are turning into a monster and act out that hallucination. This explanation satisfied the scientific world. It turned the Wendigo into a symptom. It turned the spirit into an illusion. It turned fear into a psychological survival mechanism. But there was one very large problem. Swift Runner was not starving, not sick, not isolated, and not in a region lacking food. If his mind collapsed from hunger, why was his body strong? If he was hallucinating, why could he think clearly, speak logically, remember every event in order? Wendigo psychosis explains how a mind might break, but it does not explain why Swift Runner's mind broke in that specific way. Indigenous folklore explains. The cold spirit found a weak point. For the Cree and other Algonquian peoples, Swift Runner's confession was not strange at all. They had heard every part of his story before. The voice in the snow, the cold forming inside the chest, the isolation weakening the spirit, the sense of something standing behind you, the hunger that is not hunger, the fear of harming loved ones, the whisper that finally commands, eat. To them, this was not madness. This was the spiritual boundary cracking. A person crossing into what the elders had warned about for centuries. But from the Western viewpoint, this explanation could not stand. A colonial society built on law, rationality, and Christian theology had no space for an ancient winter spirit, and so the truth split in two, forever. And the question remains, suspended in the northern air, was Swift Runner suffering from a rare psychological disorder, truly consumed by an ancient spirit of cold and hunger, or caught in a space where both explanations see only half the truth? No one has an answer. Science understands how minds collapse, but not why the fear of the Wendigo existed long before famines. Not why Wendigo's sickness symptoms match across generations. Not why Swift Runner's body remained strong. Indigenous belief understands the spiritual imbalance, but cannot explain why the Wendigo appears only under psychological strain, and cannot prove the spirit's existence in the way Western systems demand. Swift Runner's story sits exactly in that intersection, the place where science and mythology see each other, but never touch. And from here, the Wendigo enters the modern world. No longer only a forest spirit, no longer only a mental disorder, no longer only a moral tale. The Wendigo becomes an unanswered question, a symbol of what terrifies us most about ourselves. How fragile are we? And what waits beyond the boundary of reason? If you heard Swift Runner's story without knowing Algonquian folklore, which explanation would you believe, mental illness or spiritual possession? And if you knew both, could you truly claim to understand what happened on that frozen night? Share your thoughts below. After the Swift Runner case, the Wendigo was no longer just an Algonquian spirit or a rare psychological disorder. It became a symbol of what? Not a mountain monster, not a creature hunting in the snow, but a symbol of bottomless greed, right here in the modern world. For the Cree and other Algonquian peoples, the Wendigo was never simply a cannibal spirit. It was the spirit of excess, of hunger without limit, of the black pit in the human heart that can never be filled. And as humanity moved into the 20th and 21st centuries, something terrifying happened. The world began to resemble the Wendigo more than ever before. Asterisk. No longer a shadow in the snow, but a shadow in brightly lit cities. Asterisk. In the old forests, the Wendigo was the voice of winter, of cold, of isolation, of hunger. Today, it doesn't need snow. It doesn't need storms. It doesn't need a long, dark winter. It lives in things we consider normal. Endless consumption, addictions that hollow people out, the constant need to have more, despite already having enough. Humanity taking from land, sea, and each other without ever stopping. Algonquian elders once said the Wendigo was a creature with a stomach as big as the world, yet never full. Look around today. Does that feel familiar? Wetiko, a new name for an old spirit. Some indigenous scholars now use the word Wetiko to describe the modern Wendigo. Unlike the mythical creature, Wetiko is a social, psychological, and even political concept. Wetiko is the mindset that turns everything into a resource to consume. Wetiko is ambition with no ceiling. Wetiko is the emptiness that pushes people to want more. Not to survive, but to fill something missing inside. One elder put it perfectly. Wetiko is the spirit that makes people eat their own future. If the old Wendigo devoured human flesh, the modern Wetiko devours everything else. Forests, oceans, soil, time, health, communities. Asterisk. The Wendigo hasn't disappeared. It has changed forms. Asterisk. Science calls it addiction, compulsion, dopamine, hunger. Economics calls it consumerism. Psychology calls it emotional emptiness. Philosophy calls it an existential crisis. Environmental studies call it ecological collapse. But for the Algonquian people, all of these things have one ancient name: Wendigo. Not the beast standing in the snow, but a way of being in a world that never stops taking. In the old days, Wendigo warned hunters who wandered alone in winter. Today, it warns an entire civilization racing forward without knowing what it's hungry for. Ancient wisdom for a modern world. Wendigo is not a bedtime monster. It's a moral philosophy. If the hunger inside you becomes greater than what you truly need, you will lose your humanity. That hunger might be money, power, attention, control, status, success, possessions, or simply the fear of being left behind. Once it grows larger than you, it begins feeding on you, just as the Wendigo once fed on Swift Runner from the inside out. And when that happens, you don't need to grow taller, or distort, or live in a frozen forest to become a Wendigo. You only need to lose the boundary of enough. The most frightening truth? The Wendigo did not go extinct. It simply changed shape to survive the modern age. No longer a spirit of ice, no longer a hunger in the woods, but a way of living that spreads quietly, turning the world hollow. What do you think? In today's world, what resembles the Wendigo most? Consumerism, greed, or the inner emptiness that makes people never feel satisfied? Share your thoughts below. After all the stories, the winters, the rituals, and the tragedies, both mythical and real, we arrive at the end of this journey. Not in Swift Runner's cold, dark shelter, not in the vast boreal forest where the eastern wind carries ancient whispers, but somewhere far closer, inside the human heart. Because the Wendigo, since the very beginning, was never merely a predator hiding in snowy shadows. It was a story created to explain something no one ever wants to say out loud. The most terrifying darkness isn't the one outside. It's the one that can grow from within. The lesson of the northern forest. When the Algonquian ancestors told Wendigo stories, they weren't trying to scare children. They weren't inventing monsters for entertainment. They were passing down a fundamental truth of human life. When isolation lasts too long, the spirit weakens. When hunger stretches past its limits, reason fades. When greed grows beyond true need, humanity fractures. When emptiness takes over the heart, darkness will find its way in. Wendigo was their language for all of this. A vivid, heavy, painfully honest way to describe the dangers inside the human soul. And it remains true today. Swift Runner, the man caught between two worlds. Swift Runner's story is not just a crime. It is the tragedy of a man pulled to the breaking point between a collapsing world around him, buffalo gone, community broken, an ancient spirit of hunger and isolation, and a colonial system that did not understand the spiritual world of his people. He became a tragic bridge between myth and reality, folklore and law, fear and scientific explanation. And the reason his story endures is not because it is gruesome, but because it forces us to confront a question no one can answer. What truly separates a human from a Wendigo? A belief? A ritual? Or just a fragile line in the mind? The Wendigo in the modern world. Today, the Wendigo no longer wanders the snowy forest. It takes the form of endless consumption, permanent dissatisfaction, work addiction, loneliness in crowded cities, never-ending comparison. The belief that I need more, even when we have more than enough. The Wendigo does not arrive as a scream. It arrives as a tired thought. I'm still not enough. If the ancient Wendigo ate human flesh, the modern one devours time, emotions, health, community, and the connections between people. It doesn't kill instantly. It erodes slowly, quietly, like cold creeping down your collar. The true ending. When the northern wind used to sweep through the pines, people believed the Wendigo wandered, searching for weakened souls. Today, we don't fear that wind anymore. But sometimes, when you feel empty, despite having everything, when life suddenly feels small and cold, when you sense yourself drifting away from who you are, that is when the old story returns, soft as a breath. Do not let the hunger in your heart grow larger than the human in you, because the Wendigo is not the monster in the forest. It is the shadow we all carry, the one we must learn to keep still. What do you think helps a person maintain that fragile line between enough and too much? And in your eyes, what is the clearest form the modern Wendigo takes? Share your thoughts. I'd truly love to hear your perspective.